All right, thank you very much. As you said, I'm going to present our project called PREHAB. It's about predicting, mapping, and valuing biodiversity in coastal habitats of the Baltic Sea. And I'd like to first acknowledge the 7 different partners working in the project. We have 3 Finnish partners and 1 Lithuanian partner and a couple of Swedish. So, as we've seen today here, there are lots of things going on, lots of new important policy developments, and one thing is that implementation of all of these different policies, like the Baltic Sea Action Plan and many of the important directives, like the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, require a couple of new things. Among those, it is actually that it requires knowledge about the distribution of species living on the seafloor. So it's vegetation and fish and invertebrates and so on. We need one really important thing is to have better knowledge about the distribution of these of these biodiversity features. And another thing which is also important in this context is to try to evaluate what is the value, what in economic terms and other terms, but what is the value of these goods and services that this biodiversity represents. And in order to try to contribute in those areas, we have developed a project where we try to develop and test in a Baltic-wide perspective cost-efficient methods, particularly for predictive mapping of biodiversity. And I'll get back to what predictive mapping is in this context. And also to try to develop methods to evaluate the ecological consequences of different management scenarios. Ecological consequences and economic consequences. So this is what we try to do in our project. Predictive mapping, well, on land, it's actually quite simple usually to map things. You can, in many situations, it's possible to get a good idea about the biodiversity by having remote sensing methods where you can actually get aerial photographs, for instance, and you can get a large-scale, detailed information about the biodiversity and the habitats. In the sea, it is quite different. In the sea, we are confined, when it comes to biology, we are confined to small samples scattered on the seafloor, and we need to try to integrate all these samples into a coherent map and a coherent picture. And this is one of the main things that we've tried to do in PREHAB. So we've explored things like what biological features, what features of biodiversity can we predict and map? How accurately can it be modeled and mapped? And which are the useful tools and important data that we need for modeling? So on this picture here is, of course, a picture of the different steps where we have scattered biological data. We have information about the bathymetry and perhaps substrate and so on. And then we combine those types of data into this is one example of a kind of statistical model, and then we predict out in geographic space, so to say. So what we've done some 800 model runs, around 80 different biological features, and we've actually found that in many ways this approach, this predictive mapping, it actually works. We found we found useful models for fish and for vegetation in many cases, and in all of these different case study areas, we have 4 different areas in the Baltic, and we actually find quite interesting and good models in all of these different areas. We also found, of course, that there is a great need for accurate data on, in particular, data on water depth actually and substrate. Those are the key predictors that we are using. We have also used other, but they are actually the most powerful predictors in most of these models. Quite simple, but powerful. And we can also conclude that it's really important to get better data on the biological features. And that is not a trivial thing. There are issues to do with what scale to sample, what resolution for the model, how do we deal with uncertainty in time and so on, spatial and temporal variability. So there's a lot of development needed still, but overall we find that these methods actually appear to work. So the next thing that we did was to try to use these techniques to evaluate different to use these techniques and to evaluate different management scenarios. And this is one case that we have tried. These are 2 fish species. We've done it for vegetation as well. What we've done here is that we've asked the question, what will happen with the ecology? What will happen with the spatial distribution of these 2 fish species if we reach the Baltic Sea Action Plan targets? The target is an 11% increase in Secchi depth, an increase in water clarity. And using actually ensemble techniques, we've used different modeling methods here. So these error bars represent differences among different, fundamentally different statistical approaches, really. And we can see that we can see that there are complex ecological effects of if we reach these targets. Some species will be positively affected, like the perch, for instance, in this case. They will be around a 50% increase. That is what we are sort of predicting in this case. While the pike perch, that example was discussed earlier, actually is predicted to go down by well, some measure here. But what we can see here is anyway that there are complex responses to these actions, and we think that this kind of modeling is maybe a sort of a way to evaluate these. So the last part here is that we've also done to couple this to try to evaluate what are the economic consequences of this, and we've done this with a large-scale survey in Sweden, Lithuania, and Finland, and we've actually measured the willingness to pay for improvement according to the Baltic Sea Action Plan with these results. And one preliminary conclusion at this stage is that it is very different among different regions, but there is a large willingness to pay for these improvements. Finally, we are the final thing that we need to do in the project is to develop this. We would like to present our results as a user-friendly web resource. So these are, we will come up with recommendations for how to do these modeling, how to do the mapping aimed at regional and perhaps national managers. So this is what we are planning. Yeah.